When most players head to the Honest Hearts DLC in Fallout New Vegas, they see a pretty straightforward and simplistic narrative. You head with a caravan to Zion National Park, have that caravan slaughtered and ambushed, pick up some fetch quests to help the local tribesmen, side with one of two tribes, grab the survivalist rifle on your way out, and call it a day. You can't even do some deeper mediation between the Whitelegs and Graham as is seen in something like Far Harbor. It's often dismissed as the weakest DLC in the game, if not for its storytelling. Beneath that surface level tribal warfare, Obsidian hid one of the most profound and interactive theological debates in gaming history. Honest Hearts isn't merely a story about post-apocalyptic Native Americans fighting over territory. It is a four-way ideological war over the nature of God, survival, and human nature. It pits the spiritual emptiness of the Whitelegs against the tragic secular humanism of the dead survivalist, forcing players to arbitrate between the twisted New Testament mercy of Daniel and a brutal Old Testament wrath in Joshua. Now let's start right at the bottom of that theological debate. And to understand that, you need to take a look at the faction in the DLC that has no theology at all, the Whitelegs. In a post-apocalyptic world, humans naturally seek out a higher power to make sense of the devastation. They seek out a group to call their own, a faction to ally with in order to survive. The Whitelegs are terrifying because they represent what humanity becomes when it completely lacks a spiritual or moral foundation. They don't worship a god. They don't even have a culture of their own, besides painting their bodies white and wearing skull masks. This is proven more so with the cut content of Honest Hearts, where they were supposed to be varying races, showing that there was truly no creed amongst them. Men from differing racial and cultural backgrounds, all boiled down in the name of survival. This game shows us the spiritual emptiness through their idolatry. Notice their hair? They braid it into dreadlocks entirely because they idolize Ulysses, the Frumentari who originally discovered and taught them. They have no history, so they instead steal the aesthetic of a man who just happened to walk through their camp. One who happened to be holding an even more powerful and significant role in the Caesar's Legion. Their ultimate goal in Zion, after all, isn't to claim the Holy Land or survive the winter. They're slaughtering the sorrows and salting the earth of a national park purely as an audition for Caesar's Legion. They are desperate to be absorbed, their own culture holding no value to the extent that they would rather join in an amalgamation of tribes and cultures in order for power. They are willing to commit genocide just to get a nod of approval from a secular, mortal dictator. The Whitelegs are the baseline raiders. They are the violent, godless reality of the wasteland, and it is against this terrifying backdrop of spiritual emptiness that the true gods of Zion are born. If the Whitelegs show us the violent reality of a godless wasteland, the Sorrows tribe shows us the desperate human need to invent a god just to survive it. When you first meet the Sorrows, their belief system sounds like a standard primitive tribal religion. One pretty close to that of Native Americans in the real world, where they simply believe in this father in the sky, this being of the sea that protects them. Something truly primitive. They worship a deity called the Father in the Cave, and according to the myths, their father protected their ancestors from predators, left them gifts of food and medicine, and laid down moral commandments. But if you take the time to explore the hidden caves scattered throughout Zion, you uncover the most beautifully tragic piece of environmental storytelling in the entire Fallout franchise, one that anyone who's played Honest Hearts will rant and rave about, that being that Randall Clark, a normal human being, is their god. A military survivalist who happened to be in Zion when the bombs dropped, acting as their overlord, their guardian, their sniper in the wasteland, protecting a group of terrified orphan children throughout Zion. He left them medical supplies, clean water, and books, and just because the children as they grew up were lacking context, developed this divine entity as a way to rationalize Randall Clark. That's where the theology of Zion gets its heart. Randall Clark was the ultimate secular humanist. He explicitly states in his final logs that he is not a god. He didn't want worship and he didn't demand sacrifices. As he was dying of terminal illness, his final act was to leave them a note begging them to simply hold on to their humanity. But what humanity do these growing tribals have. His final commandment wasn't being that of a religious doctrine, one that you would find in the likes of something like Islam. It was instead a secular plea, one based on morals and vibes. Read, learn, be kind. Clark was a broken man himself who became a monster so that these children could afford to be innocent, to afford to live in this protected realm of Zion until the Whitelegs come along. And his secular humanism was completely misunderstood and morphed into towards this revered religion. And that tragic misunderstanding laid the exact foundation for what Joshua Graham and Daniel bring with their new Canaanite mission, to walk into Zion and project their own Christianity on top of it. Whether Joshua and Daniel come in and mess it all up is up to personal interpretation, but those same moral and ethical values carry through as we look at these twisted versions of Mormonism and more so base Christianity that Daniel and Joshua have. When the new Canaanite missionaries finally arrived in Zion, their goal was simple: preach the word of God to the primitive tribes. But they weren't walking into a spiritual vacuum. They were walking into a religion that had already been built on that loving protector of Randall Clark. So what did Daniel do? He looked at the sorrows and saw the ultimate canvas for his specific version of faith. A highly paternalistic New Testament Christianity focused entirely on peace, mercy, and the absolute preservation of innocence. The same innocence that Randall Clark wanted the sorrows to have. If you look closely at Daniel's theology, Obsidian did something brilliant. They completely stripped away the complex, distinct doctrines of real-world Mormonism. Daniel never mentions Joseph Smith, and he never talks about the Book of Mormon. He doesn't bring up multiple baptisms or celestial kingdoms. To make this conflict universally recognizable, his faith is reduced to that of base universal Christianity. He treats the sorrows like children who must be shielded from the corruption of the world at all costs. To Daniel, the physical land of Zion doesn't matter. It's just dirt and rocks. Only the spiritual purity of the tribe matters. Daniel acting out that classic pioneer fantasy. As the early Mormons fled persecution in the east, their east being Ogden, Utah, embarking on a perilous exodus to the west, the current west in fallout being Zion. Daniel's ultimate solution to the Whitelegs, that is flight. Not too dissimilar from what happened to the Mormons themselves going to Utah. He wants to lead the sorrows out of their holy land and into exile, turning the other cheek and running from sin rather than standing and fighting. Something unique to Christianity too, that I don't really think that modern day Mormonism is able to easily represent or be inlaid onto Daniel. Daniel himself, his own persecution in his life, mimics and parallels that of Mormonism, but is not necessarily Mormonism in and of itself. I think that this is an important distinction to make because many Christians view Mormonism as not Christianity, although Mormons themselves view themselves as Christian. I think it's also important to note that within the sorrows, coffee and stimulants alike are sold by Daniel's crew, meaning that whether the old tomes of the Book of Mormon are followed, who really knows? But we do know it does originate from Utah, which is the birthplace of Mormonism, and so it would not be far-fetched to say that Daniel's extent of Christianity has some Mormon tropes wrapped into it. But the structural flaw in Daniel's mercy is that it completely colonizes Randall Clark's legacy. The sorrows don't convert, they just merely absorb Daniel's terminology into their existing faith. When Daniel himself preaches about a loving God the Father, the sorrows' brains naturally rewrite it to mean Randall Clark. They're confusing the grieving park ranger with the Lord Almighty. Daniel thinks he's saving their souls through pacifism, but in reality he's keeping them weak, dependent, and entirely unequipped for the brutal reality of the post-apocalyptic world. He's forcing them to be refugees just to preserve an artificial innocence. Another allusion that I would like to bring up is the allusion to the Bible, with the names of Daniel and Joshua, which are picked not by mistake. Daniel's name and his psychology being that of a prophet who lived in exile within Babylon. He survived the lion's den not by raising a sword, but through passive and unyielding faith. Our Daniel in the game, it operates the exact same way. He doesn't want to fight the lions of the wasteland, but wants to simply endure them. And when he's finally released from the lion's den, shows that unrivaled mercy, one that we can only find in God, a value that is seen as virtuous to that of Christians and those followers of Daniel. Similarly, Obsidian tells us exactly who Joshua Graham is before he even speaks. Just look at his name. The biblical Joshua wasn't a pacifist, but a warlord in the Old Testament. He was the military general commanded by God to lead the Israelites into the promised land of Canaan, something similar to that of Zion in Fallout, and violently cleanse it of its inhabitants with the sword. Live by it, die by it. It's no coincidence that the deadliest man from New Canaan, Joshua, is currently trying to purge the Holy Land of Zion by that same sword. Joshua represents a complete and total doctrinal abandonment of innocence and mercy. When you talk with the burned man, you aren't talking to a Latter-day Saint. You're talking to something more of a 12th century Crusader. Joshua's version of faith has been entirely warped by his time as Caesar's Malpais legate. He survived being lit on fire and thrown into the Grand Canyon, but that trauma burned away any of the institutional politeness of his religion, that being from the followers of the apocalypse. There are no temples in his dialogue. There are no modern prophets or celestial kingdoms from Mormonism. His faith is that of a raw, bloody marrow of fundamentalist Old Testament wrath. Look at the scripture he chooses to weaponize. Joshua doesn't quote the Book of Mormon. He exclusively quotes the King James Version of the Bible. He doesn't quote the peaceful parts either. He quotes Psalm 137, a verse literally about praying to God for the violent destruction of enemies who have enslaved and slaughtered your people. Happy are those who do to you what you have done to us. Happy are those who seize your infants and dash them against the rocks. Joshua believes that God expects his people to do the bloody work of cleaning evil from the world. But here is the brilliant and psychological critique Obsidian is making. Joshua is using the aesthetic of Old Testament Christianity as a shield. He twists the concept of God from a complex creator into a localized god of war, just to justify the fact that deep down he is still exactly who he was in the Legion. A brutal, uncompromising warlord who happens to be wearing bandages instead of Roman armor, leading the dead horses. His defining quote, that is often used in those Sigma edits, "We cannot expect God to do all of the work," is the ultimate proof that he doesn't want to save the sorrow's innocents, nor the dead horses. He wants to forge both into a weapon against Caesar himself. And this brings us to the climax of the DLC. Obsidian built this rather complex four-way ideological war, dropping the player right in the middle of it without necessarily giving them that much influence or choice. There is no molding of Joshua and Daniel together. There is no molding of the sorrows of the dead horses into what you would ordain them to be. It really is just merely Joshua or salt upon wounds. If you side with Daniel and embrace the New Testament mercy, the sorrows preserve their innocence, but lose their holy land. They're forced to live as refugees in the Grand Staircase, surviving but forever displaced. Siding with Joshua brings the Old Testament wrath of securing Zion, wiping out the white legs, but the sorrows lose that innocence that Daniel and Clark were trying to protect. They keep the canyon but lose their soul. And this is the ultimate heartbreaking tragedy of honest hearts, no matter who you choose. The pacifist or the Crusader, you are fundamentally betraying that humanism that Clark set out to portray. The father in the cave with his one final wish being dashed. Daniel proves you can't be kind and stay in Zion, and Joshua proves you can't be in Zion and stay kind. The brutal reality of the wasteland dictating that you cannot have both cakes and eat them too. Obsidian engineered a flawless narrative system where faith, survival, and violence are inextricably linked. They strip the modern complexities of religion and ask a much darker question. When the world ends, do we need a God to tell us to run or a God who tells us to reload? But what do you guys think? Did you help Daniel evacuate the canyon, or did you help Joshua Graham do the Lord's work? Let me know your choice down in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into what's the sorrows Joshua and Daniel actually believe, feel free to hit the subscribe button. Leave me a like and see if you click on some of the other videos that I have, like this one that I made just not too long ago about the rebels and clones in Star Wars and why the clones are really the ultimate male fantasy.